the crossing of the Red Sea. What the waters conceal 800 meters deep. Underwater walls that plummet vertically like inverted cliffs, currents that drag equipment and confuse even experienced divers. The Gulf of Aqaba is no place for crossings. It is a place for shipwrecks. And yet between two shores separated by waters that should be impassable, there exists a geological formation that defies logic, a submerged natural ramp with a gradual inclination connecting two continents. As if someone had drawn a path exactly there. Before continuing with the video, do you want to strengthen your prayer life and also help our channel grow? I have prepared a material with more than 50 special prayers to guide you. Click the link in the description and help our project spread the word of Christ. This formation does not appear at any other point in the Gulf. To the north, abysses. To the south, vertical drops that exceed 1,500 meters in a matter of a few kilometers. But at that specific point, between the Sinai Peninsula and the coast of Saudi Arabia, the seabed behaves differently. The slope descends gently to about 80 meters, maintains a kind of underwater plateau for approximately 8 kilometers, and then rises gradually on the other side. Divers who explored this region describe the sensation of being before a submerged road, a road that should not exist. The story begins long before modern expeditions. It begins more than 3,400 years ago in the plains of ancient Egypt, when an entire people decided to abandon everything they knew to follow an 80-year-old leader toward a land that most had never seen. The book of Exodus records that 600,000 men, besides women and children, left Egypt that night. Scholars who analyze these numbers suggest that the total group could have exceeded 2 million people. Think of the logistics of moving 2 million individuals through a desert, without paved roads, without detailed maps, without communication systems, only faith and a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. The biblical text describes that God deliberately did not lead the people by the shortest way, the coastal route that led directly to Canaan. That path was controlled by Egyptian and Philistine garrisons. A military confrontation would be inevitable. Instead, the people were guided by a path that seemed strategically absurd, toward the desert, toward the sea, toward a geographical dead end. And it was exactly there that Pharaoh saw his opportunity. The records indicate that the Egyptian army mobilized for the pursuit included 600 chosen chariots, besides all the other chariots of Egypt, each with experienced officers and warriors. Egyptian chariots were the most advanced military technology of the time. Pulled by 2 horses, manned by a driver and an archer, these vehicles could reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour on favorable terrain. For a group of refugees on foot carrying children, the elderly and flocks, the Egyptian cavalry represented certain death. The people of Israel encamped before the sea, mountains on one side, desert on the other, water ahead, army approaching from behind. There was no logical way out, and it was in this moment of absolute despair that Moses stretched out his hand over the waters. The account of Exodus chapter 14 describes that a strong east wind blew all night, dividing the waters and turning the seabed into dry land. The waters formed a wall on the right and another on the left. The Israelites crossed during the hours of the dawn, probably between midnight and daybreak. When the Egyptian army attempted to follow by the same path, the wheels of their chariots began to swerve. Panic spread. And then, at the command of Moses, the waters returned. No Egyptian survivors. The text is specific. Not a single soldier remained. For centuries, this narrative was treated exclusively as a matter of faith. Secular historians classified it as a founding myth, a symbolic story created to strengthen the national identity of Israel. Traditional archaeologists considered it unlikely to find any physical evidence of an event so ancient and so extraordinary. But then came the divers. Ron Wyatt was an anesthetist from Tennessee, United States, without academic training in archaeology or ancient history. What he had was an unshakable conviction that the biblical accounts described literal events that left physical traces. In 1978, Wyatt conducted his first expedition to the Gulf of Aqaba, focusing specifically on the region known as the Straits of Tiran and the waters near Nuweiba Beach on the Egyptian side. What he claimed to have found reignited a debate that continues to this day. Coral-covered structures with shapes that suggested chariot wheels, metal axles embedded in the seafloor, formations that looked like large-scale bones, possibly of horses. In one specific dive, Wyatt claimed to have located a golden four-spoked wheel, consistent with representations of Egyptian ceremonial chariots from the period of the 18th dynasty. The photographs and footage that Wyatt produced generated intense reactions. Supporters saw in them definitive confirmation of the biblical account. Critics pointed out serious methodological problems, lack of precise coordinates, absence of independent laboratory analyses, impossibility of verification by academic teams. Some specialists suggested that the supposed wheels could be natural coral formations, which frequently grow in circular patterns around objects or even spontaneously. The controversy surrounding Wyatt, however, did not end the expeditions. Other explorers followed in his footsteps, some with more sophisticated equipment and more rigorous methodologies. In 2003, a team led by Swedish researchers used side-scan sonars to map the seafloor in the region. The results showed anomalies in the seabed that did not correspond to typical geological formations, although the team was cautious in its conclusions. Technical divers who descended to greater depths beyond the initial 60 meters that Wyatt had explored reported finding additional structures scattered across the extent of the underwater ramp. The dispersion of these objects, according to some reports, followed a pattern consistent with a pursuing army that would have been suddenly submerged, a greater concentration at the beginning of the ramp, where the troops would be more grouped, and gradual dispersion as currents would have carried debris over the centuries. How would 3,400 years of marine action affect ancient military equipment? Wood from chariots would disappear completely in a matter of decades. Leather and fabrics, months. Bones could last longer depending on conditions, but would eventually dissolve or be covered by sediment. Metals such as bronze and gold would be the most resistant, but even these would undergo significant alterations. Coral, in particular, has a tendency to grow over any submerged object, potentially preserving original shapes while concealing the true surface. This process of coralization explains why the identification of ancient artifacts on the sea floor is so complex. A 3,000-year-old bronze object covered by coral does not look like bronze. It looks like stone. It looks like a natural formation. Only chemical analysis or careful removal of the coral layers could reveal what is underneath. And it was exactly this type of analysis that was never permitted in a broad manner in the region. There is a geopolitical factor that complicates investigations. The area where the supposed discoveries were made is located in disputed territorial waters near sensitive borders between Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Permissions for underwater archaeological expeditions are extremely difficult to obtain. Local governments show little interest in facilitating research that could attract controversial international attention to their coasts. The result is that decades have passed without definitive scientific investigations being conducted. Meanwhile, scientists from other fields approached the issue from different angles. In 2010, researchers from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the United States published a computer modeling study that analyzed the physics behind the division of waters. The phenomenon studied, known as wind set-down, occurs when strong and persistent winds push water from shallow areas, temporarily exposing the bottom. The study concluded that a wind of approximately 100 kilometers per hour, blowing continuously for about 12 hours, could create a dry passage in certain geographical configurations. Critics of this model pointed out that the Gulf of Aqaba is too deep for wind set-down to function in the manner described. The depths in the region exceed hundreds of meters, not the 2 or 3 meters necessary for the phenomenon. Defenders of the model responded by suggesting that the crossing could have occurred in another location, perhaps in the Bitter Lakes or at the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, where the waters are significantly shallower. The question of the exact location remains central to the debate. The original Hebrew term used in the biblical text is Yam Suf, frequently translated as Red Sea, but which literally means something like Sea of Reeds or Sea of Rushes. This led some scholars to propose that the crossing did not occur in what we today call the Red Sea, but in a marshy region further north, which would have been drained or altered over the millennia. Other researchers reject this interpretation. They argue that the biblical description of waters forming high walls on the right and on the left does not correspond to shallow marshes. The text suggests significant depth, real danger, a barrier that would normally be impassable. Furthermore, the remainder of the Exodus account indicates that the Israelites traveled through the Sinai Desert after the crossing, which would be consistent with a route through the Gulf of Aqaba toward the Arabian Peninsula. Archaeologists also examined the coast of Saudi Arabia in search of related evidence. The region known as Jebel al-Lawz, a mountain in northwestern Arabia, was proposed by some researchers as the true Mount Sinai. If this identification is correct, the crossing through the Gulf of Aqaba would make geographical sense as an access route. Explorers who visited Jebel al-Lawz reported finding a stone altar, ancient pillars and rocks with markings that could be consistent with the biblical descriptions of the Israelite camp. Again, Saudi authorities severely restricted access to the area, hindering formal academic investigations. Government resistance fueled theories that regional governments had something to hide. Why prevent researchers from examining geological formations and ancient structures? Why not allow the international scientific community to determine once and for all whether or not evidence of the crossing exists? The answers vary. Some suggest concerns about uncontrolled religious tourism. Others point to political tensions that make any confirmation of biblical narratives inconvenient for certain governments. There is also the simpler possibility that authorities simply see no benefit in opening their territorial waters to controversial foreign expeditions. Regardless of political obstacles, science continued advancing in laboratories and research centers far from the waters of the Red Sea. Geologists accurately mapped the underwater topography of the region using satellites and depth sonars. These maps confirmed the existence of the ramp formation that so caught the attention of explorers. The Nuweiba underwater ramp, as it became known, remains a geological anomaly that has no equivalent in other parts of the Gulf. Oceanographers studied the currents, temperatures and sedimentation patterns of the Gulf of Aqaba. They discovered that the region possesses unique characteristics that could, in theory, preserve certain types of artifacts better than other marine areas. The high salinity, low temperatures at depths, and the relative scarcity of certain degrading organisms create conditions that differ significantly from open oceans. Historians, in turn, examined Egyptian records in search of references to the military disaster described in the Bible. The results were inconclusive. Ancient Egypt had a well-documented tradition of omitting military defeats from its official records. Pharaohs were considered divine, and admitting a catastrophe of this magnitude would be unthinkable. If an entire army was lost in the Red Sea, it is likely that Egyptian scribes simply did not record the event, or described it in such a coded way that it became unrecognizable. There is, however, an interesting chronological anomaly. The period commonly associated with the Exodus during the reign of Ramesses II, or possibly his predecessor, coincides with significant changes in Egyptian military policy. Records indicate a temporary reduction in expansionist campaigns and a period of reorganization of the armed forces. Some researchers have suggested that this pause could be consistent with the loss of a significant portion of the army, although alternative explanations also exist. The question of the plagues that preceded the Exodus also received scientific attention. Researchers proposed natural explanations for several of the phenomena described: proliferation of red algae that would turn the Nile water reddish and toxic, leading to the death of fish, proliferation of insects, diseases in livestock. The eruption of the volcano of Thera, present-day Santorini, was suggested as a possible cause of climatic disturbances that could explain prolonged darkness and other phenomena. These theories, even when plausible, neither prove nor refute the biblical account. They only demonstrate that some elements could have explanations within known natural laws. For many believers, the search for natural explanations misses the central point. If God is omnipotent, they argue, there is no need for natural mechanisms to explain miracles. The division of the Red Sea could have occurred in a completely supernatural way, without leaving traces detectable by modern science. Faith does not depend on archaeological evidence, and the absence of physical proof does not constitute proof of absence. This perspective, while theologically valid, does not satisfy those who seek empirical confirmation, and it is precisely this tension between faith and evidence that keeps the debate alive. Each new expedition, each new underwater mapping technology, each new sediment analysis generates expectation that finally something definitive will be discovered. The numbers involved in the biblical narrative help to dimension the scale of the event. If 600 chariots were mobilized, and each chariot was manned by at least 2 soldiers, we are talking about at least 1,200 military personnel in the elite units alone. The text also mentions additional horsemen and infantry troops who probably accompanied the main force. Conservative estimates suggest an army of 5,000 to 10,000 men. The total loss of this force would represent a devastating blow to any ancient nation. As for the people of Israel, the crossing of 2 million people through a passage in the sea, even if wide, presents impressive logistical challenges. If the passage was 1 kilometer wide, which would be consistent with the observed underwater formation, and the people walked in organized groups with an average speed of 4 kilometers per hour, the time necessary to complete the crossing would be several hours. The biblical text indicates that the crossing occurred during the night, which is consistent with this estimate. The flocks that accompanied the people added another layer of complexity. Sheep, goats, oxen, and donkeys do not move at the same speed as humans. Keeping the animals organized and moving during a night crossing in unknown terrain with the pressure of a pursuing army would require extraordinary coordination. The biblical text does not detail how this was managed, but the simple mention that all the people and their flocks crossed suggests an event of genuinely monumental proportions. After the crossing, the journey was only beginning. 40 years of wandering in the desert awaited. 40 years during which an entire generation would be born and die before the people finally entered the Promised Land. The crossing of the Red Sea, as spectacular as it was, represented only the first step of a much longer transformation. And it is here that the spiritual meaning begins to overlap with the historical. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthians centuries later, interpreted the crossing as a type of baptism. Just as the Israelites passed through the waters and emerged as a free people, Christians pass through the waters of baptism and emerge as new creatures. The slavery in Egypt corresponds to the slavery of sin. Pharaoh corresponds to the forces that imprison the soul. The sea that opens corresponds to the salvation offered by God to those who trust in Him. This typological reading does not diminish the historicity of the event. On the contrary, it depends on it. If the crossing did not happen in a real way, the symbol loses its force. Paul was not creating an allegory out of nothing. He was identifying divine patterns in historical events, showing how God operates in consistent ways through the centuries. The same pattern appears in other parts of the New Testament. The letter of Peter mentions the flood of Noah as a prefiguration of baptism. The letter to the Hebrews presents the entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament as a shadow of the heavenly realities fulfilled in Christ. The crossing of the Red Sea fits into this structure as one of the fundamental events that reveal the redemptive nature of God. Beyond theological interpretations, there is an undeniable cultural impact. The crossing of the Red Sea became a universal symbol of liberation. During slavery in the United States, African American spirituals frequently made reference to the Exodus and the Red Sea as an expression of hope for freedom. Civil rights movements in various parts of the world invoked the same image. The narrative transcended its specific religious origins to become part of the common vocabulary of humanity when speaking of oppression and liberation. Existentialist thinkers found other meanings in the story. The moment when the Israelites found themselves cornered between the sea and the army represents the human condition before situations apparently without exit. The choice to advance toward the unknown, trusting in an invisible promise, exemplifies the leap of faith that defines authentic existence. The sea that opens is not only a divine miracle, but also a metaphor for the possibilities that arise when one dares to face the impossible. Artists of all eras portrayed the scene. Renaissance paintings show Moses with his staff raised, while monumental waves curve into impossible walls. Hollywood cinematic productions recreated the event with increasingly elaborate special effects. The scene of Charlton Heston dividing the waters in the Ten Commandments from 1956 remains one of the most iconic images in cinema history. Each generation finds new ways to visualize the moment, reflecting its own technologies and aesthetic sensibilities. The divers who continue descending into the dark waters of the Gulf of Aqaba carry this cultural weight with them. They are not just looking for remains of chariots or ancient bones, they are seeking confirmation of one of the most formative narratives of Western civilization. Each coral formation examined, each metallic object photographed, each anomaly on the seafloor gains a meaning that transcends conventional archaeology. And perhaps that is the most important point. The crossing of the Red Sea continues to exert fascination, precisely because it remains on the limit between the verifiable and the mysterious. If conclusive evidence were found tomorrow, absolutely confirming the event, something would be lost. Faith would no longer need courage. Doubt would no longer have an object. The mystery that invites each generation to investigate, question, and finally decide for itself would resolve into factual certainty. On the other hand, if conclusive evidence definitively refuted the account, thousands of years of religious tradition would face an unprecedented crisis. Billions of people who built their lives on trust in the biblical word would have to completely reinterpret their faith. The cultural impact would be seismic. It is possible that the truth is destined to remain submerged, literally and figuratively. The waters of the Gulf of Aqaba guard their secrets with the same obstinacy they have held for millennia. Coral formations continue growing over whatever is at the bottom. Currents continue redistributing sediments. Time continues its work of erosion and concealment. But the story remains alive because it does not depend only on physical evidence. It lives in the memory of communities that transmit it from generation to generation. It lives in the Passover rituals that reenact the liberation from Egypt each year. It lives in the baptisms performed in rivers, lakes, and church tanks around the world. It lives in the prayers of people who, facing their own impossible seas, remember that a path opened once and can open again. You probably face situations that seem like dead ends, circumstances in which all options seem blocked, moments when the army is behind, the desert is on the sides, and the sea is ahead. The message of the crossing is not that problems magically disappear. It is that paths arise where paths did not exist, not necessarily in the expected way, not necessarily in the desired time, but they arise. Each person's Red Sea has unique characteristics. For some, it is a disease that doctors cannot explain. For others, a relationship that seems irrecoverable. It may be a debt impossible to pay, an addiction impossible to abandon, a fear impossible to overcome. The slavery in Egypt takes many forms, and the pharaoh who pursues has many faces. The crossing did not eliminate the challenges that would come after. The desert still needed to be crossed. Battles still needed to be fought. Mistakes would still be made. The generation that crossed the sea with faith would be the same that would doubt before giants in Canaan. But the memory of the sea that opened remained as a reference. If God did this once, He could do it again. Each future impossibility would be measured against that original impossibility. Paul understood this when he wrote that the Israelites were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. He was saying that the crossing marked a transformation of identity. The people who entered the sea as slaves emerged on the other side as a nation. The water separated not only two geographical shores, but two existences, before and after, captivity and freedom, death and life. Christian baptism carries exactly this meaning. The person who enters the water is not the same as the one who comes out. The water represents a grave, the end of a form of existence. The immersion represents resurrection, the beginning of something new. The Red Sea prefigured this millennia before Christ was born, and each baptism performed since then reactualizes that original crossing. The waters that destroyed the Egyptian army were the same waters that saved Israel. The difference was not in the sea, it was in the position of each group in relation to the opened path. Whoever followed the path of God crossed. Whoever tried to follow on their own for their own ends perished. The message could not be clearer. There is a path, But the path does not belong to us. It was opened by God for the purposes of God and can only be crossed in trust. When the last Israelites climbed onto the opposite shore and looked back, what they saw was the sea returning to its normal position. No trace of the path remained visible. No monument marked the exact point. The only evidence was the shared memory of an entire people and the bodies of an army at the bottom of the waters. Evidence enough for those who were there, a matter of faith for all following generations. And so it remains. Expeditions may continue. Sonars may map. Divers may descend deeper and deeper. But the central question was never about archaeology. It was about trust. It was about the decision to advance toward the impossible when the only alternative is to remain a slave. It was about believing that there is a power greater than seas and pharaohs, greater than circumstances and limitations, greater than everything that imprisons the human soul. What really happened that day remains debated among academics, researchers, and theologians, but what the event means is available to anyone willing to cross their own sea. The waters that seemed a barrier reveal themselves as a path. The final obstacle becomes a portal to a new life, and on the other side, where slavery can no longer reach, the true journey finally begins. 3,400 years later, the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba continue guarding their secrets. Coral formations grow silently in the dark. Currents move sediments from one side to the other. And somewhere, perhaps at 80 meters deep, perhaps deeper still, there may exist what remains of an army that pursued the impossible and found its end in the same waters that gave life to an entire people. But the most important evidence is not at the bottom of the sea. It is in the lives transformed over the millennia. It is in the communities that celebrate liberation each spring. It is in the songs of hope sung by the oppressed in every era. It is in the faith that dares to look at the sea and instead of seeing a barrier sees a path. It is in you when you choose to advance. To help us continue producing these documentaries and biblical stories, consider acquiring our ebook with more than 50 prayers. It is a way to bless this project and at the same time have a spiritual guide for your walk. The link to secure yours is in the description. Until the next video.